So this is the first of a set of talks that's starting to look at a slightly different way of using global change information. I'm going to reflect a little bit on my experiences over the last couple of decades working on the science policy interface. So that place where we're trying to provide information to policymakers drawing on our research. And I'm going to draw in particular on experiences at the IPCC, and the Global Change Research Program, and mostly try to focus on the future. I am going to employ two rules that we use at the snowmass workshops. One is no whining, and that's always an important and difficult to implement. And this one's even harder. It's not all about me, so I will try to do my best on both of these. And I do want to start with acknowledgments of Jerry and John and James, but particularly Jerry. These last few years, I've just learned so much from our collaboration working on the scenario process and the CMIPs and how the other communities relate to it and so forth. I really thank you for the opportunities to work together. And many of you under the tent who have taught me so much and without whose contributions a lot of what I'm going to talk about wouldn't have happened. So the first thing is just to reflect a little bit on IPCC and how it led me to focus on three different areas of research. I served as the Working Group 2 Technical Support Unit head during the second assessment report, so that's the period 95 to, or 90 to 95 roughly. And then later, subsequently, I've been involved in each of the IPCCs as a lead author, as a review editor, and as chair of this funky little task group that focuses on disseminating scenario results for impact and climate analysis. I just wanted to sort of show a few of the guys who really had tremendous impact on me. Two you'll obviously know, Bert Bolin and Bob Watson, the first chair, the chair of Working Group 2 when I came in, and then subsequently the full IPCC chair. Dan Albritton, many of you will know, just a superb assessor and human being. And Dave Dokken, those of you in Working Group 2 world know none of it would have happened without Dave. So I just wanted to acknowledge their role. Back at the second assessment report, Working Group 2 covered a huge territory. We had 18 impact chapters. We had 5 chapters that focused on mitigation technologies in 5 different sectors. And then we had this really sort of tacked on at the end chapter on cross-sectoral issues that Rick Lehman's agreed to chair at the last minute. Part of it was looking at land use conflicts. There was this unbelievably aggressive bioenergy scenario in one of the energy mitigation chapters, which we think probably would have used 1.5 times the surface area of the Earth to produce the biomass. But we had to see what, where was food going to fit in and so forth. And then Mike McCracken produced a little section on geoengineering, the first time that appeared in IPCC. I think Marty Hoffert actually also contributed to that. There were a lot of innovations in IPCC at that point. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but the work that I did kind of led me to focus on 3 different research topics that I think still have a lot of work remaining to be done, and I hope people will pick it up. So the first was this topic on communicating confidence and uncertainty that Steve and I worked on in the 1996 AGCI. It was partly, as we talked about yesterday, improving communication within author teams as well as with the external users. And part of the purpose really was to get people to think about low probability, high consequence events in the tails that we felt weren't being really addressed, but that if people had started to think more systematically about distributions of outcomes, they might do that. We put together a set of steps for the lead author teams to follow. It was all just about being more systematic, really, and getting people to communicate one to the other. In particular, this traceable account, which became important in subsequent in the National Climate Assessment this last round. But all of these steps have been followed in various guises in subsequent IPCC reports. We put together coordinated uncertainty language, both quantitative. This is a qualitative scheme based on looking at the amount of evidence and the level of agreement within an author team, leading to conclusions that could be anything from well-established to speculative. And of course, there was a lot of debate about the particular words used. And that brings me really to the point about future research, the need for empirical testing. right? Not only for the end users, how do they perceive the language that we're using, but also for the author teams, because we're asking many people to do something they're not used to doing. And then finally, once this has been refined, and really it needs a lot of improvement, trying to do training. So the second area of research has just involved working on vulnerability and resilience indicators. I'm showing my colleague Liz Malone from PNNL, with whom I've done a lot of this work. And this really grew out of the fact that in the second assessment report, we had these 18 impact chapters, in no way really to try to integrate across them. Working group 3 at that point was the economics working group. It was the one that was doing the damage assessments, and we weren't really necessarily in agreement with how some of that work was being done, but we had no other method to try to integrate. So the idea of the indicators was, in fact, to put together something that would enable us to quantify vulnerability and resilience. It was based on concepts of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. There were 5 sensitivity sectors for which we were collecting data: settlements, food, health, ecosystems, and water, and then 3 areas of adaptive capacity: economics, human resources, and the environment. There's a set of rules, a hierarchical procedure for aggregating this information. It could be used with both observations and with projections, so it had a capacity to enable users to understand, if we do this, then what might happen. Mostly applied in the IPCC process at the national scale, but subsequently we've done subnational and even community-based things. And there is a lot of the future research topics on improving the proxies, on improving the community engagement process and how it relates to decision making, and then also thinking about applying it in monitoring of resilience. This is something that we're thinking about trying to develop more with the World Bank, where every project is now required to be screened in terms of climate resilience, but there's really not very well developed methodologies on how to do it. And then finally, this RCP, or parallel scenario process, which had multiple motivations. One of the ones I was most interested in just had to do with bringing in more research on making the scenarios more suitable for research on IEV issues. It starts with the original process, which starts from the socioeconomics and goes to the climate. Instead, we're starting more in the middle of the chain, looking at concentrations and moving in both directions, the traditional way, into climate, AOGCM modeling. But then here, thinking about the different socioeconomic futures that could meet the constraints implied by these concentration pathways. So it's really intending, as Marty was talking about, trying to open up the possibility of looking at different ways of getting to futures, many, one of which in particular people are trying to achieve, but others that we're trying to avoid. In terms of future research topics here, I think one of the ones that's really interesting is here you can see the RCPs going from the 2.6 to the 8.5 watts per meter squared in 2100. What exactly does this range mean? We haven't really said very much, other than this was sort of the lowest scenario we could find at the time, and this wasn't the highest, but was certainly one of the highest. But what does that include? For example, there's a lot of misunderstanding that the 8.5 represents the highest that we could ever get to. This is just anthropogenic emissions. It doesn't include any biospheric feedbacks. And if people, I think, come to understand that, there's going to be a realization we better be explaining this a little better. Another thing I think we could work on is providing probabilistic information. People don't want to say how likely a socioeconomic future is, but given that we're looking at these more abstract concentration pathways without the details of the socioeconomics, don't we know, based on the emissions of the last couple of decades, and also looking at things like historical decarbonization rates, can't we say something about where we think we are in a probabilistic sense, what might be more likely in this area, so that we have a better sense of what the futures probabilities of different futures. All of this stuff has been developed in a somewhat less coordinated way, and so there needs to be work on how you bring together material on the socioeconomics with the climate. We're developing these shared socioeconomic pathways. The idea has been to develop many others, and so that hasn't really taken place yet. And of course, there's this new scenarios for CMIP6. Just in terms of my own reflections, and I won't dwell on this, I mostly wanted to use 2 quotes. There were some pretty harsh things said about IPCC on the first day, I actually think IPCC has done a great job communicating with policymakers, and I don't think we can blame the IPCC on the fact that there hasn't been any action. There was this theory of change that somehow international agreements were going to be the precondition for progress on climate change, and I think that was always a flawed idea. And what's interesting is that back in 1958, there was a set of analysts who had just met with some climate scientists about this problem, and they ended up coming to this conclusion. The type of control needed could scarcely help clashing with some of our cherished notions of free enterprise. Ordinary international agreements might prove inadequate, but an international regime that imposed actual penalties would be sure to foster great heat and controversy. Back in 1958, pretty prescient. The other one I just wanted to use was climate diplomacy will increasingly become a zombie exercise. This is by Dale Jameson in this book I mentioned earlier. But really interesting analysis, and I think unfortunately proving to be the case if you look even at the US position, where you'd hope there would be leadership, but in fact is now just saying we're going to do this all at a different level. I do agree updates to the IPCC are needed, a clearer sense of audience, and perhaps a new working group structure, shorter foundation reports, and then more ability to do focused special topics. Whether any of that can get through the political process, it's anyone's guess. So then the second thing I wanted to talk about was my experiences with the Global Change Research Program in two capacities. One, as the director of the office from 2000 to 2006, and then second on the next slide in the assessments. So this was a kind of tumultuous period, 2000 to 2006, some of you may recall. One of the things was the production of the first national assessment. Mike McCracken, really, I think everybody owes a huge amount to making that happen. And then there were also other things. Rosina Bierbaum and I worked, or I was really brought in to do this 10-year science plan for the Global Change Research Program, looking at where we were going. That was intended to produce the Gore administration science plan for the Global Change Program, and it included this strong push towards regional science. But I don't think the Supreme Court liked the plan. They elected George Bush, and then that brought in this new era of the climate change science program. And that was initiated by a Vice President Cheney kind of secret task force. It was the secret task force that preceded the energy one. And they hauled in all of the senior program managers from the agencies that had dollars in this OMB crosscut, the USGCRP, and wanted to know what they were doing. And there were sort of questions like, you're doing what? And so there was a real bias towards ferreting out anything related to impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, and focusing mostly just on atmospheric science. There were some good things that came out of it in terms of atmospheric science initiatives, but I tell you, people at agencies like EPA were quaking because there were a lot of cuts. There was also kind of a period of political influence. There's always political influence from administrations into reports and activities of the Global Change Research Program. It's always been there. This was sort of taking it to a new level. The national assessment really was suppressed. As the office director, I was instructed that it was to be taken off our website. They hunted it down, took it off agency websites. We could not mail copies out. We were told not to use public money for that. Phil Cooney was also editing, including the Our Changing Planet series and the science plan draft. And that's actually what got leaked to the media by Rick Piltz to Andy Revkin. Thank goodness that Jim Mahoney provided a lot of steady leadership to this, and we did end up producing a science plan. We converted regional science into adaptive management, which was somehow terminology that was okay, even though it was basically the same stuff. And we also then did a lot on decision support, the synthesis and assessment products, which I think many people may have come to feel was a little too much work, traditional assessments, and then a series of decision to support experiments. In terms of the second climate assessment, we've talked about that already. I just wanted to highlight the role of Jerry Melillo and Kathy Jacobs, without whom I don't think any of that would have happened. I think, as we talked about earlier, in terms of communications, it was a great leap forward. I think we have questions to look at about how well we supported sectoral and regional users. I think one of the things that came out of it, this NACANet process, which was bringing in a variety of stakeholders, like in professional associations and in regions and communities, that really surfaced the fact that there were a lot of people who did want to act on climate change. And I think that provides the foundation for a whole set of frontiers that we're going to be talking about today and some tomorrow. And the question is really, how do we better tailor the information that we produce to this broader set of users? I think that it's clear to me anyway that we cannot meet the needs that they have with a top-down, once every 4-year kind of report process, and we need to evolve something different. So I'm going to talk briefly, I don't know how much time I've got left, Jay, 1 minute, so I'll race through something about the sustained assessment as well as some improvements in IAV science and decision support. So the sustained assessment is this idea of taking the information that we produce and making it available to this broader audience, and in particular to regional and sectoral experts who can do their own assessments with it. So everything isn't now coordinated from the top down. There's a lot of bottom-up work. We talk about some of the steps that are needed to get there, and we base this a lot on the NRC reports that looked at how to better inform decisions. Maybe the best way to get it across is to contrast it with a model that everybody is familiar with, the IPCC, which is involving centralized production of approved reports. It is a report-refocused process and really kind of criticized for being too linear. The sustained assessment is much more decentralized. Not all of the products are approved, right? So if people out in Cincinnati are producing their own climate vulnerability assessment or adaptation plan using US GCRP results, that's not something that the National Climate Assessment has to approve or review until it gets to producing one of its periodic 4-year reports. If it wants to bring that into the assessment, that's the point where it would end up being reviewed. So it's really intended just to to generate a lot more activity. The adaptation science piece we talked about previously, so I won't go into that, but really just trying to explore what's involved in preparing, doing a better job preparing science in each of these 4 areas. And I think it really involves a more systematic approach to IV science. Those of you who may have been involved in the early days of the US GCRP remember the framework: observing systems, process research, modeling, and then find end use or assessment. Those were the main categories that each area worked in. I think if we thought more systematically about priority IAV topics using this framework, I think we'd actually begin to identify both what we could draw on as well as what's missing. And then finally, this decision support chapter, which Bill mentioned in his talk. The first time we ever had a decision support chapter, it was great to work with Lynn Scarlett and Howard Kunreuther and Bob Lempert and others. We basically organized the chapter around this framework of iterative risk management and looked at the resources that were available for each of these steps. So if you wanted to follow a process like this, where could you get information or tools that could help you do it? And we didn't have time to go into evaluation of the different support processes that were available. Wow, someone's really rushing me along. So we did look at a way, similar to maybe if those of you working on the indicators process, to understand how we could develop decision support tools in a more systematic way across the chapters and sectors. So again, here are the frontiers that I think are really important. The sustained assessment process. There's a whole bunch of methods for assessment in terms of scenarios, valuation methods, which I think Michael's going to talk about later, looking at the international implications and societal teleconnections, IAV research, and then finally what we'll talk about today, decision support sciences research. So with that, I just want to thank you and thank again everybody for their work on all of this.
Thanks, Richard. I think that's enough to get a discussion going. There's still a couple of minutes, so let's take a question.
And Roger, you want to come up and get set up while so you can start disagreeing with everything I've said?
Yeah.
When you talk about sustained assessment and not having sort of a big report, I think that sounds great. But not having any feedback sounds a little scary to me. Is there any way that you could establish some sort of process for, peer review or, getting some input into what will happen maybe at a regional level, but to make sure, Cincinnati doesn't go off the rails and 4 years later they get slapped by the national assessment.
Well, so I think there are a couple of ways that can happen. One is when we worked on the decision support chapter, we realized that I think there's a lot of private sector involvement that's going to happen. And so just as we now have weather service, companies that are working with weather service data and providing all kinds of specialized forecasts, we think that there's eventually going to emerge a market of companies that are providing these kinds of services, again, based on the research data that we're producing. There ought to be some professional standards and review of these kinds of things that are established. I wouldn't say necessarily it all would have to go through the national assessment, but you could certainly, just as we now today have professional societies that review the practices of their groups, and the people working within them, that's going to be one mechanism of trying to provide feedback on good practice in these areas. And I weren't saying there wouldn't be any reports. There would still be the periodic 4-year report that I think in the process of evaluating through these regional teams and so forth, some feedback could be provided. But I think it's an important issue.
So John,
No.
we got way more than, I think we may have to say
Yeah.
this for the discussion period. So I'm going to give John, because John, the last word.
Richard, could you give kind of just a quick impression of the USGCRP's role going forward in terms of how the agencies view it, how the USGCRP has the cooperation it needs, etc.?
Yeah, so I certainly can't speak for the agencies. Right. I just want to be clear about that. Roger will give the answer to that question. But
I am the Roger. I speak for the agencies.
Right, Roger that. And I do think that the coordination mechanism probably needs some rejuvenation. They have produced a strategic plan that outlines a lot of objectives, adaptation science. I think that the ideas are there, but my sense unofficially is that there's a certain pulling back from some of these objectives at the moment, and people are nervous about reception of this program on the Hill, and are trying to be as careful as they can to make sure they don't stray from what they feel is their already agreed mandate. And so I just think that probably some rejuvenation is necessary. And I also am very concerned that we don't see any clear steps yet for implementation of the sustained assessment. I know that there's been a committee, but there's not been very much announced about what they're actually going to do. I think they should appoint a new advisory committee to help provide guidance, but I am a little worried about that.
All right.